And then they are the interpretation of tongues. Now, tongues are important. And as much as tongues are important, the interpretation is even just as important, if not more important. Because in tongues, people can practice tongues, and those are tongues of the devil. I know people who can practice speaking in tongues, and that doesn't mean anything. You have to get those tongues from the infilling of the Holy Ghost. So the interpretation of tongues is this. When there's tongues being spoken, if you are a seasoned Christian with a discerning spirit, you will know when somebody is just speaking in tongues or praying in tongues, or when somebody's bringing a prophecy in tongues. There's just a different air to it. I believe in chapter 14, or maybe the same chapter, they talked about if the trumpet blows a sound of uncertainty, how will the men know what to do? In other words, when you're on the battlefield and they blow the trumpet, there's a trumpet sound for attack, there's one for advance, there's one for retreat. So the sound must be clear. So when a prophecy comes, an interpreter knows when it's a prophecy and when it is just someone praying out in tongues. Not only that, but oftentimes, if things must be done in decency and in order, as we'll talk about in the next closing days, the person who's leading the service cannot be a novice, because they must have an ear to understand if it's a prophecy or if it's just speaking in tongues. And if, say, for instance, we had a young person leading the service, then a more seasoned vet would have to take the service over and say, hey, there's a word of prophecy here, and God has given somebody the interpretation. Would you please step forward and give the interpretation? And so if you have the gift of interpretation, then you're able to step forward and say, thus saith God. And when you say, thus saith God, and you start speaking, what you're actually doing, you're interpreting in English what the Holy Ghost wants to say to the church in unknown tongues. And when you are on target, because you cannot pretend to be able to interpret, and I've seen it many times, you have to really have the gift of interpretation. So they're speaking in an unknown tongue, but while they're speaking in the unknown tongue, God is revealing everything to you in English, and we'll come back tomorrow.